Good afternoon, everyone. So when I got dressed this morning, I thought to myself, I know I'm going to be speaking at a podium, so I don't need to press my pants. So I come here and I see the podium is made of ice. Now I've drawn attention to every wrinkle that's in my pants. The last time I was here 2 years ago, I was talking about Pixar, and I told the story of how we turned that very sleepy, failing graphics company into an entertainment powerhouse. Today, I'm very grateful to have been invited back by Richard and his team to talk about a different topic. And this topic is the relationship between prosperity, burnout, and an ancient philosophy that I've been studying for the past 20 years called the middle way. So let me start that with a hypothetical of sorts. Imagine that you are playing a video game, and the goal of that video game is to build a civilization. And at the beginning of the game, you get to set out certain assumptions about how that civilization might flourish. You get to set the ratio of the land to water, of the forests to the plains, the average temperature, the number of humans, all kind of parameters. Then you hit start and the game plays. When your civilization fails, you get a little window that comes up that says, game over, would you like to play again? And you can play to your heart's content. You can just do civilization after civilization, and you just get a report that tells you how well all your civilizations are doing. Well, in Silicon Valley, where I spent my career, it operates by exactly the same principle. If you zoom out of Silicon Valley and you take a bird's eye view of how it functions, basically, we set up lots of little startup companies with a set of conditions or assumptions. Assumptions about the future, assumption about markets, about talent, about leadership, about resources, about money, all kinds of assumptions, and we see which ones flourish. Very few flourish. They fail because it turns out that the conditions that are required to flourish in the long term are very rare. We don't see that very obviously because we don't see all the things that failed. You never see the Silicon Valley startups that didn't make it, but it's most of them. 97% of them, I would say, don't make it. My first book, To Pixar and Beyond, was a story about a company that should never have flourished and how we resolved the competing tensions that were pulling at each other, in that case, the creative tensions and production tensions and business tensions that were tearing the company apart. And it's a story about how one company did it. But for the past 20 years, I've been applying this principle to a different question. And that's the question that I'm here to talk about today. And the question is, if humanity were a startup, what would it need to do to flourish in the long term? And the reason I ask that is because I'm not convinced that the assumptions by which we are living now are actually the ones that we need in order to flourish. So I'm going to address this in 3 parts. The first part, what's the problem? Why do I stand up here and say we aren't flourishing the way that we could be? The second part is, what has my journey into the world of Eastern ideas, and particularly Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and meditation, taught me about that problem? And the third part is, what's the solution? What might we do to course correct so that we'd have a better chance of flourishing in the long term? So the first part, what's the problem? I call this the perils of prosperity. It's based on an observation about modern affluent culture, that the competencies for a culture to prosper materially tax that culture psychologically. I first noticed this in Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, I would say, is ostensibly the greatest prosperity generation machine in all of human history. Never has so much wealth been created in one place so quickly. And if prosperity were the key to the good life, I would expect Silicon Valley to be the land of joy. It isn't. It's much closer to the land of stress than it is the land of joy. And then, it wasn't just in Silicon Valley that I began to understand that this was a problem, but it was in all domains in modern culture. Almost 2 years ago, I received a letter from a faculty member at the Yale School of Medicine in the field of pediatrics. And he said to me, "I've read your book, and I think that in medicine, we could benefit from these ideas of meditation in the middle way. Let's talk." I wrote back to him and said, "I know nothing about the field of medicine." And he said, "It doesn't matter. We've started this 2-year collaboration on this problem, in which I learned that burnout is definitely not limited to Silicon Valley. It's happening in our schools. It's happening to our children. It's happening to our college students. It's happening to our parents. Everywhere we look, we seem to be suffering from some form of mental anguish." So when I talk about burnout and mental anguish, what do I mean? What am I talking about? It takes many different forms. Some of those forms are the existence of inner agitation or inner stress. That takes the form of stress, burnout, loneliness, and what I call a kind of hypersensitivity or irritability. Little things trigger us more than they should. Some of those things can get very clinical in nature. Clinical anxiety, clinical depression, suicidal ideation, suicide. And then there's a new kind of mental anguish that's kind of unique to the last 10 years or so that I call technology angst. It's not that there's anything wrong with technology, but the problem is that we have developed an unhealthy relationship with it. And like any unhealthy relationship, when you have an unhealthy relationship, it produces stress. For example, in the case of technology, it takes the form of an always-on kind of way of being. Technology is like a tractor beam that's constantly pulling us in. We cannot take our eyes away, stop ourselves from staring at it. Another way that technology hurts us or causes us anguish is what I call algorithmic tethering, which is that all the big technology companies are deliberately and knowingly writing algorithms that are designed to hook our brains into their technology. A very simple example of that is when you watch any video on Netflix or Amazon and it ends, you get something that comes on that says the next one's going to start in 5 seconds. It used to be 20 seconds, but you watch, it's really quick now. It's like 8 seconds. They've figured out exactly how many seconds it needs to be. And it's hard for us to tear ourselves away from it. That's an example of algorithmic tethering. And another way that technology is causing us anguish is what I call data loss. Data loss means allowing others to benefit from our private data. This is a huge problem in our world right now. We are giving away our digital, it's like we have a digital double. We have a digital life and we have an actual life. And other people are using our digital life. That life should belong to us. And that's a problem. It causes us stress. But it's not just the presence of these kind of negative attributes and agitation that's a problem. It's the absence of positive attributes as well. The absence of things like joy, the absence of self-worth or self-esteem, the absence of meaning and purpose and friendship, even the absence of something as simple as play. Having fun is very central to our humanity. Having fun means coloring outside the lines. It means going outside of the normal rules and conventions and playing. And we don't do that as much as we used to anymore. So we're missing these things. This is not just anecdotal information. There is a ton of data to back this up, and I'll cite some. In 2019, a Pew study said that anxiety and depression are on the rise among America's youth. 2 surveys of almost 800,000 college students showed an almost doubling of suicide attempts, depression, and anxiety from around 2010 to 2018. In the 2019 Gallup Global Emotions Report, Americans were more likely to be stressed and worried than much of the world. And I quote, they said, "The disconnect between a strong economy and Americans' increasing negative emotions illustrates how GDP and other hard economic data only tell part of the story." In the work that I've done in burnout in medicine, 50 to 70% of people in healthcare have symptoms of burnout. Rates of loneliness in the United States have doubled in the last 50 years. In 2018, Britain appointed a minister of loneliness to combat loneliness in that country. My conclusion from all of that is that I have come to see mental anguish as the pollution of prosperity. It's the toxic waste of accomplishment that poisons us if we're not careful with it. The world of the material, the world of performance, the world of consumption by itself is not enough for us to flourish. And the reason for that is because we are the energy source for that prosperity. It draws down our energy in order to produce all the things that we enjoy, and that depletes us. And it depletes us without putting back what it takes. So I felt this was a really big problem. And so I decided to go on a journey to find some answers of what it might take to fix this. This started about 15 to 20 years ago. At the beginning, I read very widely. I read philosophy and literature and all manner of religion and history and everything. I landed on a Buddhist school of philosophy that's called the Vajrayana. We would know it more commonly as Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. I considered it, and still do, humanity's most sophisticated system of inner learning. Why did I feel that? Because it was not about religion. It was not about dogma. It was about one thing and one thing only, which is the transformation of conscious experience into something luminous, something radiant, something joyful. To me, this was amazing. It was like discovering the Holy Grail, a beautiful system of inner growth built on a philosophy that they call the middle way that rejects dogmatic thinking. That had a strong appeal to my very cynical and skeptical mind. So I wanted in. And then I discovered I couldn't have in. Access to that system of thought is almost completely closed off to us, and it was certainly closed off to me. It is locked up in Tibetan monastic orders that have existed for 1,000 years, and in order to gain access to it, you basically have to be a 5-year-old Tibetan boy who was sent to the monastery to spend your life there. The cultural divide between us and them, I discovered, was enormous. But I eventually broke the code. I broke the code because I found a teacher who was willing to teach me. His name is Segyu Chopal Rinpoche. He's a Vajrayana, a Tibetan Buddhist master and lineage holder, which is about as high an accolade that one could have in that system. He's also Western. It's very rare to have this combination. He lives in California, but he's from Rio. His life was dedicated to one task only, which was gathering all the wisdom of that 1,000-year-old tradition and bringing it here. And he spent 30 years of his life doing that, going over to his teachers over there 2-3 times a year, gathering it. I've now been a student of his for 20 years, and together with 3 other co-founders, we created the Juniper Foundation to bring to modern world all of the insight and wisdom of that tradition. Over the course of this time, I came to perceive that tradition and those teachers and masters differently. I came to perceive them not as sages from the past, but as messengers from the future. Men and women who were here to beckon us and tell us where we need to go. And here's a summary of their message. First, that mind, not matter, is the driver of experience. It's not that outer conditions and material conditions don't matter at all, but they matter much less than we think they do. If we want to understand the sources of our inner anguish and the sources of our suffering, we have to look at the mind and how it is relating to the world around us. It's the inner noise, the inner agitation that is making us miserable on the inside. That's the first point. The second point is that we can transform the mind. We can transform the mind to be something clear and luminous and radiant and joyful. This is what makes their tradition so inspiring to me. Having identified the mind as the locus of suffering, they also identify it as the locus of joy. It's emanating from the same place. They often compare the mind to the sky, saying that sources of inner anguish are like clouds blocking the sun. And all we have to do is move the clouds and the sun's just going to shine all by itself. So that's their second point. And their third point is that to realize that potency, we have to free the mind from rigid inner patterns and narratives that keep us imprisoned. And those patterns and narratives are the clouds. And the way out is this elusive philosophy called the middle way. The middle way essentially is the path by which we come to see how what we take to be truths are in fact just paradigms, just conventions, just stories. And when we see them like that, we can free ourselves from them. So I'm going to illustrate now what some of these stories look like in contemporary culture. They're so pervasive, some of them, that we don't always recognize them as narratives, but I'm going to put them in that perspective. The first narrative is what I call the narrative of perfectionism. Perfectionism is the drumbeat of high-performance culture. No matter what we do, we want to do more, we want to do it better, and we want to do it faster. Performance and perfectionism dominate our mental space. Every aspect of our system demands it of us. But countless sources describe how the pressures of perfectionism lead us to misery. How the pressures of perfectionism make us unduly hard on ourselves. How the pressures of perfectionism keep a voice in our head that keeps telling us we're not doing enough. We never feel like we make it, and that we live in fear of failure and mistakes. Small mistakes, big reaction. A woman that I know in San Francisco, highly accomplished in many different domains, put it to me like this just a few weeks ago. She said, "Why are we all so accomplished and feel like shit inside? Like we haven't done anything, like we aren't good enough." The reason for that is the narrative of perfectionism. It's an elusive goal. A second narrative. This is the narrative of consumption, or the narrative of materialism. The drumbeat of that narrative is that prosperity will solve all of our problems. The second drumbeat would be money and possessions will make us happy. No matter how many studies we see that money won't make us happy beyond a certain minimum amount, we don't care. Because we want to believe that narrative, that money will make us happy. And the most insidious incarnation of this particular narrative in our world today is a distortion of values in which we rate measurable values as more important than non-measurable values. We now live in a world in which we run our lives by things that we can count. So we value things like grades, things like wealth, things like school rankings, things like popularity that now we can measure with social media. We value those things more than we value non-measurable things, like friendship, having dinner with a friend, connection, joy, play, wonder. We keep those down there because we can't measure them. This does us a terrible disservice because that distortion of values creates a lot of inner angst. I call it the great outsourcing of our self-worth. We measure our self-worth by somebody else's algorithm, and instead of measuring it something that is just beating from inside of us. And I'll mention one other narrative that I call the narrative of individualism. We live, sometimes it feels like, in silos or in spacesuits. Walk down the streets of New York, or anywhere, San Francisco or anywhere for that matter, everyone's in a silo. The problem with that is that we lose human connection. We lose the culture of mutual support and empathy and collaboration. It's no wonder that there is so much loneliness. That causes us a lot of suffering because we human beings are social beings. That has been proven over and over and over again. We thrive with collaboration. We thrive on connection and cooperation. We wither without it. So the more siloed off we are, the more angst we will feel. So the big question, as I see it, is how do we maintain all of our ingenuity, all of our capacity for material well-being and prosperity without succumbing to the toxicity of those narratives? And that is the middle way. To benefit from useful paradigms without being consumed by them. So the third part of this is, what do we have to do in order to accomplish that? What's the course correction that will change the toxic narratives on which our prosperity is based? Well, in short, we have to leap from a story that prioritizes consumption, the material, and performance over all other imperatives to a story that values both mastery over the material outer world and mastery over the mind, the inner world. Matter and mind together. I call this leap, I didn't name it this way, a second renaissance. It's from the late biologist Francisco Varela, who wrote in his book, The Embodied Mind, the rediscovery of Asian philosophy, particularly of the Buddhist tradition, is a second renaissance in the cultural history of the West. Now, he was a scientist, he was a biologist. Why did he say that? He said that because he came to the conclusion that we are ignoring the one thing that will generate more well-being over any other, which is the mind. And the masters of cultivating strength of mind are those philosophers over there. So what will it take in order to generate that kind of correction? The first thing, I used to say, by the way, we should all meditate or something like that. I am for meditation, and I'll speak about that. But now I have a slightly different view of it. I think the first thing that we have to do is prioritize our inner life. Not to ignore it, not to treat it as a sideshow or an afterthought. That tends to be the way we approach it now. I have my whole life going on, and I'll fit in a little meditation and yoga on the weekends or when I have time. That is not going to affect the kind of change that I'm talking about. It's a big change because our consuming priority right now is performance, is materialism, is perfectionism. We have more faith in the material than we do in the mind. And we have to change that. My teacher, Sege Rinpoche, describes it this way. He says there are two axes to life. The one axis, think of it as a horizontal axis. He describes as the evolutionary axis or the material axis. It's the axis in which we just bump along the stages of our lives, from birth to youth to young adulthood, middle age, old age, death. We just go along that whole axis doing the best we can. But there's another axis, he says, that intersects that horizontal axis. He calls that the spiritual axis or the energetic axis. It's the axis in which, as we go along that evolutionary journey, we build up our inner strength. We build up our strength of mind. We more and more become joyful, noble, radiant beings. But that's a different axis. And the problem today is that we are completely ignoring that vertical axis. So we have to prioritize it in order to benefit from it. The second thing we have to do is act on that priority. Now, how might we do that? It's quite simple, I think. We have to immerse ourselves in methods and content that will replenish the mind. What kinds of methods what might those look like? Well, it's an engagement in contemplation and contemplative practices. Meditation is an amazing contemplative practice, but not just meditation. Meditation coupled with immersion in the topics of inner learning. What are those topics? Well, what is the nature of the mind? What is peace of mind? What does mean to be compassionate and kind? What does it mean to have emotional harmony? What is the middle way? These are unbelievably rich topics. And when you couple them with the practice, your own personal practice of meditation and contemplation, they're unbelievably transformative. I'll say just a brief word on meditation, because meditation is kind of all the vogue now, but I think there's a lot of confusion about it. To me, meditation is quite simply the space for cultivating positive states of mind. That's it. It's a space for cultivating positive states of mind. In order to do that, we have to turn off the noise and the distraction on the outside so we can enable a new kind of realization on the inside. That's why I wake up every morning and do my morning meditation. It doesn't have to be a lot. We don't have to give up our jobs and families and retire to a cave or a monastery somewhere. Not at all. But it does have to be a priority. It does have to be regular. It ought to be a really peaceful, beautiful part of our day. A sanctuary in our lives dedicated to one thing, my quality of mind, your quality of mind. And I believe we have to do this not just individually, but organizationally. Our institutions and organizations could benefit enormously from this kind of thinking. If we're going to change the world, our leaders need to embrace that kind of vision too. Imagine a world in which our leaders were oriented to service, not to self. Imagine a world in which our leaders considered the impact of their organization's actions on all the constituents around them, not just the shareholders and not just those who are reaping the profits. Imagine if our leaders led from a base of dignity and compassion and service, values that acknowledge our humanity as well as our capacity for great work and performance. Imagine if we returned to leadership the spirit of nobility and sacrifice. This may seem very far-fetched in a world in which corporate and political leadership seems to be going in the exact opposite direction. But all of that will fall out of a mind orientation to life and to the world. And the third thing that we have to do, the first is prioritize our inner life, act on that priority. The third is value the power of connection and community. We have to get out of our silos in order to be healthy. Nurturing a healthy mind is a team sport. It may not seem obvious to us, but it is. And these masters and teachers from long ago knew it. And they valued the meaning of, they had a word for it called Sangha. They valued the meaning of community. In a 2018 book called Lost Connections, a book on depression, it says this: the more you think that happiness is a social thing, the better off you are. The evidence suggests if we return to seeing our distress and our joy as something we share with a network of people all around us, we will feel better. That's proof of that point, that this inner growth is a team sport. So these three elements, prioritizing our inner life, acting on that priority, and cultivating communities that will nurture and support us, will, I believe, transform our lives and our world in immeasurable ways. So to wrap up, the more that I've looked at the problem of burnout and mental anguish, the more certain I am that they are not weaknesses, they are not failings, they are not shortcomings. They are a healthy response to a toxic world. They are a sign that says my needs as a human being are not being met. It's like a fever that you get in response to a bacterial infection. If you get a bacterial infection and you have a fever, no one suggests that you're weak because you got a fever. We have to treat the infection and the fever and make them both go away. Mental anguish is the fever, and the infection is the toxicity of a high-performance culture. So my answer to the question, if humanity were a startup, what would it need to do to flourish in the long term, is this: we need to embrace a new perspective on life. one that is born not from consumption, not from performance, not from greed, not from materialism, but from the power of the mind for inner well-being, for inner radiance, for joyful living. From that base, we can apply all of our cleverness, all of our ingenuity, all of our capacity to build an amazing and prosperous civilization. My journey into the world of Buddhist ideas and philosophy has been like discovering a new world. And yet, in the vision of the philosophers of the Middle Way, that world is right here, right in front of us. It's simply a shift in perspective. It's not a place that we need to go. We can do it. All we have to do is reach out and grab it. Thank you. And we have time for questions, so yes.
Thank you very much. I have a comment, which is, you could take out the word Buddhist there, and it would be appropriate.
Totally.
Because all of the truths you pointed out are the perennial truths at the core of all of the wisdom traditions. Socrates, the life that's not reflected upon is hardly worth living, and even our secular philosophers. But there is a point that I wanted to sort of emphasize in the Buddhist tradition. The Buddhist first truth is that the world, there is suffering, and that there is a liberation from it, but there's a tremendous emphasis on overcoming ignorance and the relationship of overcoming the ignorance of believing you're separate with compassion, with recognizing the suffering of others and engaging to serve them. To talk about this path without reference to bodhisattva vows, the concept that one would serve others and eliminate suffering, neglects, I think, the most powerful dynamic of the Buddha's revelation, which is not just the centrality of deconstructing the mind and its illusions, but the importance of the heart, the importance of loving kindness and compassion. Could you talk about that shift from love of self to selfless love, that shift from loving things and using people to loving people and using things, that shift that opens up the heart to that open space? How did that happen to you?
Well, I can't say it did happen to me, but I can certainly talk about what I think about that shift. So yes, the root of this path that I'm talking about is what we would colloquially know as the hero's journey. The bodhisattva that you refer to is the quintessential hero. And the arc of the hero's journey through all the traditions that you mentioned is the same, which is that to be of great value to the world, you first have to heal yourself. And this is the thing that we miss, and this is why I didn't emphasize it a lot. Because what we want to do is change the world and not ourselves. We want to live in the domain. I'm really compassionate. Silicon Valley is full of this. It's everyone wants to save the world. No one wants to save them, or not save themselves, heal ourselves first. Because what happens if we don't work on ourselves first, our actions to so-called save the world can be just born on a foundation of pure ego. Not to say that good work doesn't happen on the basis of ego, but it won't change. It won't bring about the change that the Buddha was talking about. One reason it says Buddhist up there, and certainly we could drop it, and one day we will drop it. But the reason it's there is because it's easy to gloss over the depth of these traditions. And it's very easy to kind of whitewash things and try to pull in a little bit from here, a little bit from there. And it's there to convey this is rooted in something really deep. And it's that rooting from our meditation and the work that we do, we gain that kind of rooting. And from that rooting, then we should go save the world. By the way, it's Luke's arc in Star Wars. I mean, Luke had to spend, not to talk about Star Wars, but why not? But what happened to Luke? And Luke didn't go save the world, right? Luke had to go get trained by Yoda, right? He had to go to some crazy planet and lift Yoda out of a swamp before he was any good to the world. And his training on that planet is exactly the training of Shantideva and the Buddhist teachers. He had to concentrate his mind to lift that spaceship out. He had to calm down his anger, and he had to see through the reality in front of him so he could feel the force. That's Buddhist training. And so even Luke had to go through the training before he was any good to save the universe. Yeah.
Thank you. I truly appreciate that you spent these 20 years on this path. But my question is there one single actionable thing that I or other people in this room could do starting this afternoon or tomorrow?
One single actionable thing? Well, press your pants if you know you're going to speak on a crystal clear podium. Yes, I mean, I would say, I would certainly encourage anyone to start a meditation practice, but I'm not cavalier about it. Like, starting a meditation practice isn't fun. You sit there and you're just concentrating on something and your mind is just spinning all over the place. But I would still encourage it. But if you're going to start a meditation practice, if there were one thing that I would do is before you do that meditation, as you sit down and do it, acknowledge the fact that you are now prioritizing your inner life, that this matters to you, right? But you start to acknowledge that, if you have the motivation that I'm going to prioritize this is important in my life, it will open up other doors. Meditation will be one of them probably, but there may be others. And so if there was one thing, I think that would be it. Mm-hmm. How long does it take to raise the starship? So it's all, that's a really good question, actually. One thing to know, this is why I love the middle way, it's all metaphor. You're raising the starship with your mind. You really are. So that's how you cultivate that concentration. Yeah.
I have a lot of experience with the stuff that you're talking about, and just as an answer to the question we just asked before, what's the first thing you might think about? I would say the first thing to do is just try to slow everything down, and that's a really great.
It's great. I take that too, definitely. If you do meditation practice, things will start to slow down. See, the thing is, when you start to meditate, the problem is, you sit down to meditate, so, okay, I'm going to calm the mind. I'm going to calm the mind, I'm going to focus on my breath or whatever the object is. But your mind is going 1,000 miles an hour, so as soon as you sit down to try to meditate, you cannot slow it down. It's like trying to stop a cruise ship on a dime. There's so much inner momentum. So the first thing that happens when you meditate is you notice that, and it's annoying. So you have to get used to that. But then it will naturally begin to slow the mind down. Yeah. Sorry, what advice?
What advice would you give your kids?
Well, with my kids, so we were, my wife Hillary is also very involved in this journey together, and we made a decision not to impose it on them. And so we would just talk about this stuff. We just talk about it all the time, but never by imposition. This is what I advise for a lot of people on this. None of this can be done by imposing on other people. The best, people sometimes say to me, how do I get my kids to be less stressed out? And my answer is, you be less stressed out. So we have to model the way we want our children to be. And so my advice for kids is more advice to parents, which is model the way you want to be, but don't impose on kids a model that you yourself are not acting on, because they'll pick that up. And so that's one answer to that.
Was very high powered and very speedy. And do you think you could have done your Pixar journey and be the person that you are now?
That question is, could I have done my Pixar journey and be the person that I am now? 100% yes. I'd be better at it. This has not be, the reason is because I have capacities in that domain. I'm good at startup strategy. I'm good at leadership in startup. I don't know how or why, just that's my capacity. We all have talents and capacities. nothing that I've done has diminished that. If anything, I think it probably would have enhanced it. I had awareness of these things while I was at Pixar. So I never, even when I was running really fast in those circles, I maintained a very healthy perspective because I knew there was a kind of, I perceived it as a game to be played rather than some reality itself, sort of a thing. But I think, this is a confusion that we have. This will make us stronger and better at whatever we do. I'm convinced of it. For example, I'm sort of high energy, hard worker. Like my wife was always telling me, like, when are you going to relax or sit down or something like that? That's my nature. So this hasn't changed my nature. But when I do the things that I do, I'm just not that stressed. I'm just enjoying it. So I think it'd be good. So, awesome. Well, Richard, thank you very much for having me back. And thanks for having me.